I want you to imagine for a moment a world where you were born into slavery, where from the moment you open your eyes, you are someone's property. You want to play sports? No sorry, you need to wash your master's clothes. You want to study this thing that you find interesting? Nope, sorry, you are serving your owner's guests at his lavish banquet. This is the world that Epictetus came into. By the time of his death, he would be universally honored as the most brilliant philosopher of his age, and as a man that the emperor himself would approach with humility. But at the beginning, he was simply a slave. He was born into a world that made it legally impossible for slaves to be freed before the age of 30. So no matter what, he was in it for the long haul. The name we know him as isn't even his real name. Epictetus simply means acquired one in Greek, a constant reminder of the world he was born into. Which is pretty strange that when he's a free man, renowned as the wisest man of his time, he never once stopped and said, hey, by the way guys, my name's Derek. He never really pointed things out about himself unless it was relevant to the point he was making. An example of this is that he had a bum leg, which he never explained how he got, because he would only point it out when making a point that lameness can be an impediment to the body, but not to the will. He never found it really relevant to explain why he was hobbling around everywhere. Now, even though he never said it, there are still a few theories about how it happened. One legend has his cruel master twisting his leg as a punishment. While the master was twisting, Epictetus was calm, simply warning him that if he kept twisting it, the leg would break. Eventually, they heard the snap. His leg was demolished. But instead of crying out in pain, Epictetus simply said,
"Not the kind of person to say I told her so, but you know what? I told her so. I told her so."
Although this is generally accepted as the true story, likely because it's the most interesting, we should never let the truth get in the way of a good story, I don't think this is actually what happened. Epictetus, as a slave, was owned by Epaphroditus, who himself was a former slave that worked his way up to the upper echelons of Roman society and was friends with the emperor at the time, Nero. The life of Epictetus is dualistic in this way, where yes, he was a slave at the lowest rung of society, but he was also surrounded by, and tended to, the wealthy elite. He may have been lowborn, but he was in the same room as the most powerful people in the world. From this vantage point, Epictetus got to see firsthand that although legally he was a slave and they were free, they were more enslaved than he was, because they were slaves to their desires and fears. Epictetus may have also been at the banquets attended by the Emperor Nero himself, who would have been being advised by one of the other big three Stoics, Seneca the Younger. At the time, these two men couldn't know how intertwined they become in the history books, but if they did, they'd likely be looking at each other like this from across the room. These were the early years of Epictetus, born into slavery, not in charge of his own body, a truly difficult upbringing. But as he would later state to his students, it is difficulties that reveal what men amount to. And so whenever you're struck by a difficulty, remember that God, like a trainer in the gymnasium, has matched you against a tough young opponent. As the title of emperor changed hands over the years, an emperor named Vespasian had banished the Stoics from Rome, trying to quell their impact, because our philosophy is super cute and powerful and dangerous to those in charge. But for some mysterious reason, Vespasian allowed one very well-known Stoic philosopher named Musonius Rufus to stay and continue giving lectures. And as author James Romm writes, attending these talks was a young man, a foreign-born slave, whose name would soon be known across the Roman world, Epictetus. And this is where I want to introduce an interesting theory about Epictetus that I can't seem to shake. It's like a hole in history that doesn't add up when you look at it. No historian really states why Epictetus would go on to attract the following that he had. They never question why people would travel the world to see him. The books simply say he was wise, he was a great philosopher, maybe that he used the Socratic method of questioning. But the average person in Rome, just like the average person today, didn't care about that stuff. There were a bunch of philosophers around, many of them a lot closer to Rome than Epictetus. I think the real reason is hinted at, but historians aren't able to put their finger on it. Again, from James Romm, we hear of Epictetus's magnetic personality. You hear about his students in his lectures being in awe of his words, how he was electrifying, how he had this powerful effect on his students. So I'm gonna go ahead and say it. Epictetus was the most charismatic motherfucker in the land, bro. He was the Rizzler of ancient times, and everyone wanted to be around him. That's just what it is. Every time I try to figure it out, it keeps coming back to this. Everyone keeps saying it's because he had this flawless philosophy record, that he was a literal Stoic sage. But historians aren't able to recognize the absolute aura on the guy, because, you know, they're historians. But Epictetus was just charismatic as fuck. That's all it is. We have a slave being allowed to study philosophy with one of the world's foremost teachers. Although it's not completely unheard of, educating a slave was incredibly rare. And this isn't just a random teacher that he got either. I imagine the cost of studying under Musonius Rufus was quite a bit of money that his owner had to pay for. But Epictetus was just this gem to be around. He had that aura, that vibe of destiny. You know how Paul Atreides in Dune can just say something and people listen to him?
Consider what you're about to do, Paul Atreides.
Silence!
Epictetus was that. In Gen Z speak, if we saw Epictetus today, we'd say, he's him. And we'd be right. He had main character energy. By the way, this is why I believe Epictetus was just born with a lame leg and his master didn't twist it. It seems that Epaphroditus was a decent dude and cared about Epictetus, especially if he cared enough to pay for his education. We can say that maybe it was because he felt bad about what he did when Epictetus was a kid, but I'm just not seeing it. I feel the twisted leg story is cap, for real, for real. Back to the story though. After spending multiple years studying with Musonius Rufus, Epictetus was eventually granted his freedom. There isn't information on when, or how, or why, just that he was. Again, there's so many times you just wish that Epictetus would give us a hard flex. Some sort of biographical information. Everything we have of the guy is just hearsay because he was just focused on teaching philosophy. Never once did he tell us something that would give us more info about him. Upon becoming a free man, he opened up his own school in Rome, attracting even bigger crowds than his teacher Rufus. At a certain point, the Emperor Domitian, son of Vespasian from earlier, banned all philosophers, and especially Stoics, because they're so powerful and cute. Epictetus would go over to Nicopolis in Greece, where he would spend the remainder of his life. Again, there's no record of complaint or anything from the man, he just went. Once he set up school in Greece, folks from all over Greece and Rome would come out to see him. As he taught, he had two very important people come and listen to his lectures. The first was a young Hadrian, who would learn from Epictetus and go on to become the Emperor of Rome. These two things are entirely unrelated, by the way. He didn't become emperor because of Epictetus, he just happened to see the value in his teachings, much like everyone else, really. Hadrian would famously set up a succession plan that would end with our famous Stoic emperor, Marcus Aurelius, ascending to the throne. We'll talk more about that in a minute as well. The next very important student that Epictetus had was named Lucius Flavian Arrianus, who we will call Arrian for short. Arrian was a high-born, studious fellow who felt compelled to take notes of Epictetus' teaching. And by notes, I mean this guy was writing. Epictetus, like Socrates and Cato, never wrote anything down. The only reason that we have an idea of what he talked about is thanks to Arrian, who felt compelled to write down everything, word for word, which became known as the Discourses of Epictetus. There were 8 books in total, only 4 of which survive for us today. The 4 discourses that we have total nearly 90,000 words. Assuming that the other 4 were the same length, that's 180,000 words that Arrian felt compelled to write just because they were spoken by our boy, Epictetus. This man had aura. Arrian, or Arrian, also took the best lessons from Epictetus and summarized them into a short work called the Enchiridion. In Greek, this stands for handbook, as it's meant to be kept on your person, so you can refer to it in a pinch. My favorite version of this is translated by Chuck Chakrapani, and I liked it so much that in 2017 I recorded the audio for it. That's available on Audible. Once written down, Arrian's slaves took down a bunch of copies, and Arrian would lend them out to his close friends that he felt would appreciate them. Slowly, without any conscious intention, these discourses made their way into the public. Many years later, one of these copies of his discourses got into the hands of a Stoic philosopher named Junius Rusticus, who would introduce the legendary works of Epictetus to one of his students, and even loan him his own copy of the discourses. This young man, Marcus Aurelius, was being groomed to be the next emperor and would put Epictetus up there among the greatest philosophers in history. To Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus was on the philosophical Mount Rushmore with Socrates and Chrysippus. No doubt had Epictetus lived longer, he may have been brought back to Rome to tutor young Marcus, or perhaps Marcus would have been sent east to sit at the master's feet. As it is though, we don't have much information towards the end of Epictetus' life. We know that he continued lecturing in Greece for the remainder. We know that at some point he adopted the child of a friend who otherwise would have been left to die. And we know he had this weird fascination with an oil lamp that was stolen by a thief. He mentions that a lot. Once his oil lamp was stolen from his house, he shrugged his shoulders and bought himself an earthenware one. This lamp made it into the Epictetus lore for whatever reason. Upon his death, an admirer of his purchased this oil lamp for 3,000 drachmae, the equivalent of $130,000 US today. Again, this man Epictetus was just a full-blown rock star. It's crazy. I don't understand it. Epictetus had to build outdoor bathroom facilities because early in his school, when he let his students use the bathroom inside the house, he kept catching them in his bedroom, sniffing his underwear. That part I made up, by the way. That didn't happen at all. Or maybe it did, to be honest. Charisma makes people do strange things. But just as he lived his life, refusing to elaborate on his story, what his name was, or how his leg got mangled, Epictetus died around 135 AD with no fanfare. He likely died with just his child and the woman he lived with at his side, quietly and without complaint. Epictetus was the closest we've come to what would be considered the mythical Stoic Sage. And although he wrote nothing down, he showed us through his example how one should live. Just as wood is the material of the carpenter, and bronze that of the sculptor, Epictetus told his students. In the art of living, each individual has their own life to use as material. Epictetus used the material of his life to demonstrate how to live, and we got very lucky that we got the works of his that we did. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, I'd appreciate if you could support the channel by liking the video, commenting, sharing this with friends, and subscribing. Thank you.